So let's look at the species concept. The syllabus objectives are to recognise the need for multiple definitions of species, and also you have to be able to identify an example of an interspecific hybrid that does not produce fertile offspring. And there's an example here, the mule. So one of the most widely used definitions of species is the biological species concept or definition. This is the one that says a species is a group of organisms which can breed with each other in their natural environment to produce fertile offspring. So here's a couple of key things. So first of all, they need to be able to breed. It needs to be in the natural environment. So not sort of like putting them together in a zoo, but they're natural. They would naturally meet in the environment. And the offspring that are produced are fertile. In other words, the offspring are capable of themselves reproducing. So that's a biological species concept, and it's very much widely used. Now, there are some issues with this concept. What about asexual reproduction? Bacteria that reproduce through asexual reproduction. They don't meet this criteria for biological species definition. We're not able to say whether there are specifically different species. Whether or not they can reproduce and produce fertile offspring, of course they can't because they produce asexually. Another one is that species that are extinct in fossil record and things, when we're unable to theorize whether they're the same or different species, because there's no evidence about whether they could reproduce naturally in nature and produce fertile offspring. And another one is that there's a number of different species like ants and bees and wasps that have sterile workers. So with bees, we've got sterile workers and that do a whole heap of different, worker tasks. And then we've got the queen bees, which are fertile. So it's a division of labour. And so it's a problem because we look at the sterile workers and we're not able to tell whether they are able to reproduce and produce fertile offspring because they're sterile. So there's some of the problems with it. Some other problems is that we have varieties. So varieties are things like dog breeds. Are they the same species? And subspecies. So in different areas, we have different species or different variations of the same species. Now, are they able to reproduce? This introduces an idea of the ring species, where over a geographical area, you're wrapped around a geographical area, maybe across continents or across a country or something, that we have interbreeding of the subspecies or varieties that are next to each other, but there's variation in these characteristics in a graduated gradient, and so we call that a cline. C-L-I-N-E. A cline is where we have a variation across a geographical area, variation in a property, such that if these two ends of the ring were to meet up, then they would actually be significantly different enough that they wouldn't be able to reproduce naturally and produce fertile offspring. So this is what we call a ring species. It's another one of the problems of the biological species definition. The problem with this one is that we have a gradual variation over a geographical region, that the ends might not be able to reproduce, but they probably could in the middle. So a hybrid is a hybrid is when we've got two different species that mate and produce an offspring. Now, the thing with interspecifics are different species. There's a hybrid between the two species. Now, they are nearly always infertile, and so they are so they're not a new species. So we've got an example: the lion and the tiger. the hybrid is called a liger, but it is infertile, and of course it doesn't happen in nature either. It may happen in a zoo, but it certainly doesn't happen in nature. They live on different continents. They don't occupy the same niche. And when a horse and a donkey are mated together, they produce an offspring called a mule, but it's not a new species. It's a hybrid. It's infertile. It's a hybrid between two species. So there's our mule and there's the liger, both interspecific species that are infertile. Now there's a number of other definitions of species. Here's just a few of them. So there's the morphological species concept, which determines what a species is based on what it looks like. And then we've got the phylogenetic species concept, which determines species based on how similar the genetics are and the evolutionary lineage. And then we've also got the ecological species concept, which basically is looking at the niche that a species occupies. So there's other different definitions of species as well. They all have their limitations, but just like classification, we can classify species or determine species based on the reason why we're doing it in the first place. And so we just need to understand that the biological species definition, maybe it's the most common one we use, but it does have limitations.